absolutely unacceptable. You need to do everything about this right now.
Ma'am, we are doing a thing of proper procedure. She's exaggerating.
My property is being damaged. Let's all try to remain calm and discuss this rationally.
Let me paint you a picture. It's 6:30 in the morning. The temperature outside is 12 degrees. There's about 9 inches of fresh snow on the ground, and I'm standing at my kitchen window in a thick bathrobe, holding a mug of coffee that I haven't even taken a sip of yet, because I'm watching something that I genuinely cannot believe is happening. There is a woman in a bright red parka standing at the end of my driveway. She's holding a clipboard, and she is taking photographs of my truck. Not of a car accident, not of some emergency. She is photographing the tire tracks my truck left in the snow when I pulled out of my own driveway about 45 minutes earlier to go plow the shared entrance road. Let me say that again. She is standing outside in 12-degree weather at 6:30 in the morning to photograph tire tracks and snow. And here's the part that really got me. She wasn't even trying to be subtle about it. She looked right up at my window, saw me standing there, and then deliberately wrote something down on her clipboard, like she wanted me to see her doing it. Her name was Diane. And at that point, I'd only lived in Maple Crest Estates for about 8 months. But in those 8 months, Diane had already introduced herself to me as the HOA's Community Standards Coordinator, which, I later found out, was a title she gave herself. It wasn't in any official HOA document. She just started calling herself that one day, and people stopped arguing with her because it was easier than dealing with her. I didn't know it yet, standing at that window, but that photograph she was taking, those simple tire tracks in fresh snow, were about to kick off a months-long conflict that would involve the HOA board, a county sheriff's deputy, a property surveyor, and eventually, one very cold, very inconvenient lesson about what happens when you push someone who actually knows their rights. And here's the part I want you to hold on to while I walk you through this whole story. I never once raised my voice. I never once lost my temper. I just kept doing exactly what I was legally allowed to do, and I let the situation handle itself. But before we get to how it all ended, and trust me, the ending is something Diane absolutely did not see coming. Let me back up and explain how I ended up in this neighborhood in the first place, and exactly why I was the one plowing that road at 6 in the morning. I moved to Maple Crest Estates in late April of the previous year. It's a small planned community, about 42 homes total, in a rural part of the Midwest, about 20 minutes outside of a mid-sized city. The kind of place where the houses have real land around them. Half-acre lots, mostly. Some bigger. The kind of place people move to specifically because they want a little breathing room. I'd been renting in the city for years, and when I finally had enough saved up to buy, I knew I wanted land, a garage, and somewhere I could keep my equipment. I do property maintenance work, landscaping in the summer, snow removal in the winter. It's my business. I have a pickup truck with a plow attachment, a small tractor, and all the gear that goes with it. When I found the house in Maple Crest, it checked every box. Good price, solid bones, a detached garage big enough for everything I needed, and a nice big lot. I read through the HOA covenants before I made an offer. That's something I'd always heard you were supposed to do, and I actually did it. The rules were pretty standard. Keep your lawn maintained during growing season. No junk vehicles stored in front of the home. Exterior paint colors to be approved by the board for new construction. Fences require board approval. That kind of thing. Nothing unusual. Nothing that seemed like it would be an issue. What the covenants also said, and this part is important, was that the shared entrance road that connected all 42 homes to the county highway was a private road. It was maintained by the HOA collectively, meaning the cost of maintenance came out of the HOA dues everyone paid. But, and here's the key part, plowing and snow removal for that road were handled by a volunteer arrangement. Whoever was willing and able to plow it could do so, and the HOA would cover the cost of fuel and minor, were at a flat rate per season. The previous person who had handled that road was an older gentleman named Harold who had moved away the winter before I arrived. When I introduced myself to a few neighbors in the spring, one of them mentioned that nobody had officially stepped up to take over the plowing, and that the board was a little anxious about it going into the next winter. I told them I'd do it. I had the equipment. I was already up early. It made sense. The board, the actual elected board, not Diane, sent me a short letter in September confirming the arrangement. It laid out the terms. I'd plow the shared road as needed during weather events. I'd submit a simple log at the end of the season, and I'd receive a fuel stipend of $250 deposited at the end of March. It was a handshake deal put into writing, signed by the board president, a quiet retired engineer named Bob, and kept on file. Now Diane. Diane had lived in Maplecrest for about 11 years. From what I gathered, she had run for the HOA board twice and lost both times. After the second loss, she had apparently decided to create her own position, Community Standards Coordinator, and begin conducting her own informal inspections of the neighborhood. She'd walk the streets with that clipboard, photograph things she considered violations, and then send handwritten notes to homeowners. The board tolerated this because she had been doing it for years, and because most people just didn't want to deal with the confrontation. The notes she sent had no legal standing. The board hadn't authorized her to issue fines or notices, but most people didn't know that. They'd get a note in the mailbox from HOA Community Standards and assume it was official. A few of my neighbors had mentioned Diane to me before I ever met her. The phrasing was usually some version of "she means well" or "just try not to get on her radar." I took that at face value and figured I'd be fine as long as I kept my yard neat and didn't park on the lawn. I met Diane for the first time in July. She knocked on my door on a Saturday morning and introduced herself very formally, handing me a printed card that had her name, her self-appointed title, and the Maplecrest Estates HOA logo on it. A logo she had apparently designed herself and started using without board approval, though I didn't know that yet. She told me she liked to introduce herself to new residents and walk them through community expectations. I was polite. I offered her a glass of water since it was hot out. She declined. She walked me through a list of things she expected me to keep in mind, most of which were things I was already doing. And then she glanced over at my garage, where my plow truck was visible through the open door, and she said, and I remember this clearly, "You're not planning on using commercial equipment on the community road, are you? That's not something we allow." I told her about the letter from the board. She got very quiet for a moment, and then said she'd look into that. Then she left. That was July. By December, things had gotten significantly more complicated. The first significant snowfall of the season came on a Thursday in early December. I'm talking a real snowfall. It started overnight, and by morning there was about 8 inches on the ground with more coming down steadily. The kind of snow that shuts schools and clogs roads if nobody gets ahead of it. I was up at 5:15, which is normal for me on snow days. I had client properties to handle throughout the day, but I always started with the Maplecrest entrance road because it was close, it was quick, and it connected all my neighbors to the main highway. If I didn't clear it early, nobody could get out to get to work. I plowed the road, the whole stretch of it, about a quarter mile from the highway entrance to where it branched off into the individual driveways, and I was done by about 6:15. Good clean pass, salt laid down, everything neat. I pulled back into my own driveway, left the truck running while I went in to check on my schedule, and came back out about 20 minutes later to head to my first client. That was when I saw Diane walking toward me from the direction of the road. She was already holding her clipboard. "Good morning," I said. I wasn't particularly worried. I figured she was just out early. She didn't return the greeting. She said, "I need to talk to you about the road." I said, "Okay, what about it?" She flipped a page on her clipboard and said, very formally, "Community standards require that equipment used on shared property be approved in advance. You did not submit an equipment approval form before plowing this morning." I blinked. "An equipment approval form?" "That's correct." I told her I wasn't aware of any such form, and I asked her to show me where that requirement was in the HOA covenants. She told me it wasn't necessarily in the covenants specifically, but was part of the community standards guidelines. I asked her where I could find those guidelines in writing. She said she maintained them and would provide me a copy. I said, very calmly, "Diane, I have a signed letter from the board authorizing me to plow the entrance road. That letter doesn't mention any equipment approval form. If there's a form I need to fill out, the board would have included it." She said, "The board doesn't always keep up with community standards requirements." Think about that for a second. She was essentially telling me that the actual governing body of the HOA, the elected board, was not necessarily the final authority. That she was. I told her I'd reach out to Bob, the board president, and ask him about the form. She nodded like that was acceptable and said, "In the meantime, I've noted this as a first and formal observation." An observation of what? I asked. Of a potential standards deviation. I want to be clear about something. At this point, I was annoyed, but I wasn't angry. I'd dealt with personalities like Diane before in my work. People who have found a small corner of authority and held on to it very tightly. I knew the best approach was to stay calm, document everything, and let the actual rules speak for themselves. I emailed Bob that afternoon. He got back to me within a couple of hours. His response was exactly what I expected. There was no equipment approval form. There never had been. He said he'd been hearing from a few neighbors that Diane had been escalating her self-appointed inspections and that the board was aware of it and trying to address it carefully. He also said, and he was candid about this, that Diane had actually brought up my plowing arrangement at the last board meeting, suggesting that it violated some community standard she'd written herself. The board had voted unanimously to reaffirm the arrangement with me. He said he'd send me a copy of that meeting's minutes. I thanked him. I felt reasonably settled. The second snowfall came about a week later. 9 inches this time. Same routine. I was up early. I plowed the road. I was done before 7. I didn't see Diane that morning. I thought maybe she'd taken the hint. She hadn't. When I got home that evening, there was a note in my mailbox. Handwritten, on Maple Crest Estates HOA letterhead. The letterhead she'd designed herself. It said, "This is to inform you that your continued use of heavy commercial equipment on shared community property without completing the required community standards equipment use authorization has resulted in a formal observation being entered into your community record. Continued noncompliance may result in fines. Please contact the Community Standards Coordinator to schedule a compliance review at your earliest convenience." I read it twice. Then I photographed it, saved the photo, and put the note in a folder I'd started keeping for this exact kind of documentation. The next morning, I called Bob. He was annoyed, genuinely annoyed, which was notable because he was a pretty even-keeled guy. He told me Diane did not have the authority to issue any kind of formal observation or to threaten fines. He said he'd send her a letter from the board clarifying that. But here's the thing, and I want you to really think about this scenario for a second, because this is the part that stopped me in my tracks. 2 days after Bob sent that letter, Diane knocked on my door again. And this time, she had something new to say. She told me that while she understood the board had confirmed my plowing arrangement, she had reviewed the plat map of the community and believed that the tire tracks left by my truck when I exited my driveway and turned onto the shared road were causing damage to the shared road's edge. And that under the covenants, the actual covenants, I could be held responsible for damage to shared property. She had taken those photographs of the tire tracks in the snow to document what she was calling road edge wear. In December, in snow, she was arguing that tire tracks in snow constituted property damage. I asked her, as evenly as I could, "Diane, are you saying that every single person who drives out of their driveway onto the shared road is causing damage to it?" She said, "Other residents use standard passenger vehicles. Your truck is significantly heavier." I said, "Are you aware that I've been plowing that same road, which involves driving on it repeatedly with that truck, under an arrangement authorized by the board?" She said, "That arrangement is under review." It was not under review. I had the board minutes that said otherwise, but I let it go for the moment. I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. If you were in my position at this point, 8 months into owning your home, dealing with a person who had invented her own title, issued fake fines, and was now claiming that your tire tracks in snow were property damage, what would you have done? Drop that in the comments. I'm genuinely curious, because I've asked a lot of people this, and the answers are all over the place. Here's where things shifted from annoying to genuinely concerning. About a week after Diane's tire tracks as property damage visit, I received something in the mail that looked, at first glance, like an official HOA fine notice. It was printed, not handwritten this time, on the same self-designed letterhead. It stated that I had been assessed a fine of $75 for repeated noncompliance with community standards equipment use authorization requirements, and that the fine would be added to my HOA account if not paid within 30 days. Now, I want to be clear about what this was. This was not a legitimate HOA fine. The board had not voted to issue it. The HOA's governing documents, the actual covenants, bylaws, and rules, required a formal vote of the board before any fine could be assessed against a homeowner. Diane had no authority to do this. She knew she had no authority to do this. But she was betting that I either didn't know that or wouldn't push back on it. I sent a letter, printed, formal, certified mail, to the HOA board president Bob, and I sent a copy to each of the 4 other board members by name. In it, I explained what had happened, included copies of the fine notice Diane had sent, and asked for written confirmation that the fine was not authorized and that my HOA account would not be charged. Bob called me the same day he received the letter. He said, very simply, "This is not coming from us. Do not pay it. I'll handle it." He also told me, off the record, in the way you can tell someone is trusting you with information, that this wasn't the first time Diane had sent out unauthorized fine notices. 3 other homeowners had received similar letters in the past 2 years. 2 of them had paid. They had essentially paid money to Diane's informal enforcement operation that had no basis in the community's actual governing documents. That was the moment I realized this situation was bigger than just a personality conflict between me and a difficult neighbor. But it was about to get bigger still. 3 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, the person on the other end identified herself as a representative from a property management company called Silverline Community Management. She said she was calling on behalf of the Maple Crest Estates HOA regarding an open compliance matter. I was confused. As far as I knew, Maple Crest was self-managed. It didn't have a property management company. I asked her about that. She said she'd been engaged by HOA leadership to assist with compliance enforcement and that she was calling to discuss the outstanding $75 fine. Who engaged you? I asked. There was a brief pause. I was contacted by the Community Standards Coordinator. Diane had hired a property management company, or at least gotten someone at one to make calls on her behalf, to try to collect an unauthorized fine. I don't know exactly what she told them, or whether she paid them anything, but the call was real. I told the woman on the phone very calmly that the fine she was referencing had not been authorized by the HOA board, that I had written confirmation of that fact, and that she should follow up directly with the board president before taking any further action. I gave her Bob's name. I was polite. I thanked her for calling. She never called back. But the truck hadn't stopped rolling on Diane's end. Because the very next week, I came home on a Friday evening to find a notice from a local towing company attached to my windshield. It said my vehicle had been flagged for unauthorized commercial vehicle storage in a residential community, and that it would be subject to towing if it remained on the property. The notice referenced my home address. My truck was parked in my own driveway, on my own property, flagged for towing. I called the towing company. The dispatcher told me they'd been contacted by someone who identified herself as an HOA representative and asked them to issue the notice. He said they hadn't been given authorization to actually tow anything yet. They'd only agreed to issue the warning notice as a courtesy. I asked if he'd gotten anything in writing from this HOA representative. He hadn't. I told him, politely but very directly, that I was the owner of the property, that the vehicle was legally parked on my private driveway, and that I would hold the towing company liable for any action taken against the vehicle. He understood immediately. He apologized and said the notice was void. I then documented everything: the towing notice, the phone call, the dates, the name of the dispatcher, and added it to my folder. That folder was getting thick. Now, I was still plowing the road this entire time. Every storm, without fail. Because my arrangement with the board was still in place, the board had reaffirmed it multiple times, and I wasn't going to let Diane's harassment stop me from honoring a commitment I'd made to 41 other households. But I'll be honest with you, I was watching, and I was thinking, because here's what I'd noticed. The shared entrance road was the only paved road in or out of Maple Crest Estates. There was no alternate route. You came in one way and you left one way. And for 8 months, I had been the person making sure that road was passable when it snowed. I hadn't said anything about that to anyone, but I was aware of it. I want to ask you something directly. Does this pattern of behavior, the fake fines, the unauthorized towing notices, the property management company call, does this read to you like a neighbor who genuinely believes she's helping the community? Or does it read like someone on a power trip who has convinced herself that the rules only apply when they benefit her? Leave a comment with your honest take. Because I've talked to a lot of people about this, and the more I laid out the details, the harder it was for anyone to defend what Diane was doing. In January, things got quiet. Not permanently quiet, but quiet enough that for about 2.5 weeks, I started to feel like maybe the situation had run its course. Bob had sent Diane a formal letter from the board, not a polite note, an actual formal letter on official letterhead, informing her that she was not authorized to issue fines, engage third-party companies, or take any enforcement action on behalf of the HOA. The letter stated clearly that continued unauthorized actions could result in legal action by the HOA against her. I know about the letter because Bob sent me a copy as a courtesy. There was no response from Diane. No more notes in my mailbox. No one photographing my driveway in the morning. No mystery phone calls. She had gone quiet. My neighbors noticed too. The woman across the street, who'd lived there for about 6 years and had received her own share of Diane's notes over the years, called me one afternoon just to say, "I don't know what you did, but whatever it was, thank you." I told her I hadn't really done anything other than document everything and stay in contact with the board. She laughed and said, "That's more than anyone else did." It felt good. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Going from a stressed, folder-filling, certified mail-sending situation to just normal life felt like a genuine relief. I kept plowing the road through January. We had 4 storms that month, and every single time, I was out there early, doing the work. A few neighbors waved from their cars when they drove out in the morning. One older couple left a tin of cookies on my porch with a note that said thank you. It was a simple, genuinely nice thing. I started thinking that maybe this was just what it was going to be. Diane had overplayed her hand. The board had pushed back firmly, and she had retreated to whatever normal looked like for her. Maybe she'd find someone else to focus on. Maybe she'd mellow out. I didn't wish her any harm. I wasn't sitting around hoping for something bad to happen to her. I just wanted to live in my house and run my business in peace. But here's the thing about people like Diane, and I don't mean this cruelly. I mean it as a simple observation. They don't usually stop. They regroup. They find a new angle. They wait until they think the attention has shifted, and then they try again, usually from a direction you weren't expecting. So while I was stacking firewood on a Saturday afternoon in late January, feeling reasonably at ease about the whole situation, I wasn't thinking about Diane at all. I probably should have been paying closer attention. Because about 10 days later, everything changed, and it didn't start with a note in the mailbox this time. It started with a knock on my door from a man in a county sheriff's uniform. I opened the door to find a county sheriff's deputy standing on my porch. He was polite, professional, calm. He introduced himself as Deputy Mercer and told me he was there regarding a complaint that had been filed with the county sheriff's office concerning my property. I invited him in. I offered him coffee. He declined, but he did step inside out of the cold. He explained that a complaint had been filed alleging that I was operating an unlicensed commercial business from a residential property in violation of county zoning ordinances. The complaint also alleged that I was storing commercial vehicles and equipment on residential property in a way that violated HOA regulations and potentially county code. And it alleged that I had caused structural damage to shared community road infrastructure with my commercial plow vehicle. I listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Can I ask who filed the complaint?" He said he couldn't share that information at this stage of an inquiry. I said, "I understand. I have a good idea, but that's okay. Can I show you some documentation?" He said yes. I went and got the folder. I showed him the signed letter from the board authorizing my plowing arrangement. I showed him the board meeting minutes reaffirming it. I showed him copies of the unauthorized fine notices Diane had sent. I showed him the towing notice and the notes I'd taken about my phone call with the towing company dispatcher. I showed him the formal letter the board had sent Diane in January. Deputy Mercer looked through everything carefully and methodically. He didn't say much while he was reading. He just read. When he was done, he set the folder on my kitchen table and said, "Okay, I need to ask you some questions, and then I'd like to take a look at the road and your property, if that's all right with you." He asked about my business, what I did, whether I was licensed, whether I had any business registration. I told him yes to all of it. My business was registered with the state. I had a contractor's license. I had liability insurance. I had a vehicle registered for commercial use. All of it was proper and documented. He noted all of that down. Then we walked outside. He looked at my truck, which was parked in my driveway. He noted the commercial registration on the plates. He looked at the garage and confirmed that the equipment inside, the plow attachment, and the tractor, were stored out of public view and not creating any visible nuisance. Then we walked down to the shared entrance road. Deputy Mercer looked at the road. He crouched down at a couple of spots and looked at the edges. He stood up. He said, "What's the road made of?" I said, "Asphalt over a gravel base. It was last repaved about 4 years ago, according to the board records." He nodded. He walked the full length of the road. all quarter-mile of it, and came back. He said, "The road looks fine to me. I don't see any structural damage." He paused. "I also don't see any indication that normal vehicle traffic, plow truck or otherwise, would cause the kind of damage described in the complaint." He was professional and measured about it. He wasn't dismissing the complaint with a wave of his hand. He was doing his job. But he was also a person with eyes, and he could see what he could see. As we were walking back toward my house, I saw Diane approaching from down the street. She was walking quickly, still holding her clipboard, and she was wearing the kind of expression that suggested she had been watching for the deputy's car to show up and had been waiting for the right moment to come over. She introduced herself immediately as the Community Standards Coordinator. Deputy Mercer introduced himself politely and asked how she was involved. And Diane started talking. She said that I had been in repeated violation of community standards for months. She said the board had been unable to effectively address the situation. She said the road damage was extensive. She used the word extensive at least 3 times, and that it had been documented photographically. She said my commercial vehicle constituted a nuisance to the community. She said she had received numerous complaints from residents about my operations. Deputy Mercer let her finish. Then he said, very evenly, "Ma'am, what's your official role with the HOA?" She said, "I'm the Community Standards Coordinator." He said, "Is that an elected position?" She paused. "It's an appointed position." He said, "Appointed by whom?" Another pause, longer this time. "By the community." He said, "I ask because I've been reviewing some documentation from the homeowner here, and it includes correspondence from the HOA board, the elected board, stating that you are not authorized to issue fines or take enforcement action on the HOA's behalf. Can you tell me more about that?" The clipboard came down slightly. She said the board didn't always have a full understanding of community standards requirements. Deputy Mercer said, "I'd like to speak with someone on the board. Do you have contact information for the board president?" She said, "I can provide that." He said, "That's all right. I already have it from the homeowner. I'll reach out to him directly." And here's where I have to give Deputy Mercer full credit for how he handled this. He didn't embarrass Diane. He didn't tell her she was wrong or that she'd wasted his time. He thanked her for her information, told her he'd be in touch if he had further questions, and asked her politely if she minded giving us a few minutes to wrap up. She minded. You could tell she minded quite a bit. But she left. Deputy Mercer turned to me and said he was going to contact the board president and follow up on a few things. He said that based on what he'd seen and read, there wasn't an obvious violation of county code on my end, but he wanted to complete the inquiry properly. He said he appreciated that I had documentation and that I'd been cooperative. Before he left, I asked him one question. I said, "Is it common for complaints like this to come through?" He thought about it for a moment and said, "HOA situations? More common than you'd think." He didn't editorialize beyond that. He got in his cruiser and drove out on the road I'd plowed that morning. I stood on my porch for a moment. I felt okay about how that had gone, but I also knew that something had shifted. This wasn't just a neighbor leaving notes in a mailbox anymore. We were now in the territory of formal government inquiries, and that made me think very carefully about what my next move needed to be. Has anyone watching this ever had authorities called over something this minor? A tire track in the snow, a truck parked in its own driveway? Drop a comment, because I have a feeling some of you have stories that would make mine look calm. Deputy Mercer called Bob the same afternoon. Bob called me that evening. He said the deputy had been thorough, professional, and direct. He had asked Bob to confirm in writing the details of my plowing arrangement, the board's authorization, and the status of Diane's self-appointed role. Bob had sent him everything that afternoon. The original agreement letter, the board meeting minutes, the formal letter to Diane from January, and a brief written statement from all 5 board members confirming that Diane did not hold any official position and had no enforcement authority. Bob also mentioned, and I want to be precise about this, that the board had consulted with their HOA attorney, a step they'd been putting off for cost reasons, and that the attorney had advised them to formally document Diane's unauthorized activities and retain copies in the HOA records. The attorney had used the phrase potential liability exposure in reference to the fake fine notices she'd been sending out. This was getting serious in a way that went beyond my property and my truck. The board was now dealing with the legal fallout of years of Diane's unchecked self-appointed enforcement. About a week after Deputy Mercer's visit, he came back. This time it was a follow-up visit rather than an active inquiry, and he brought a written summary of his findings. He shared the relevant parts with me. His conclusion, based on the documentation he'd reviewed and the site visit, was that there was no credible evidence of a county code violation on my property. My business operation was properly licensed. My vehicle was properly registered and parked legally. The road showed no evidence of unusual structural damage attributable to my vehicle. He had noted that the complaint had been filed by a third party. He still didn't name her, but we both knew, and that the documentation provided by the HOA board did not support the claims in the complaint. He said the inquiry was closed. I thanked him. He said, "Keep that folder organized. Sounds like it's been useful." Good advice from a man who'd clearly seen this kind of thing before. Now, here's where the situation started to turn in a way that Diane had not anticipated, and in a way that, honestly, I hadn't fully planned either. It just happened logically, the way things do when you let documentation and truth do the work. The board, energized by the attorney's advice and frankly fed up with the years of disruption, held a special session. They sent formal written notice to all 42 homeowners in the community summarizing the situation, that an individual had been issuing unauthorized fine notices using HOA branding, that at least 2 homeowners had paid those fines, and that the HOA was working to address the situation. The notice explicitly stated that no enforcement actions were authorized unless they came directly from the board in writing on official letterhead. The effect of that notice on the community was immediate and significant. 3 more homeowners came forward and reported receiving unauthorized fine notices. 2 of them had paid. The total amount collected by Diane through her unofficial enforcement operation over the course of roughly 2.5 years came to somewhere around $900. That's not a massive sum, but it's real money that people paid based on the false belief that they were being fined by their HOA. The board, on advice of counsel, sent Diane a formal demand letter. It required her to return the collected funds to the homeowners who had paid them, cease all community standards enforcement activities, and stop using HOA branding on any communications. When Diane received that letter, she apparently showed up at the board president's door. Bob told me about the conversation later. She was not quiet about it. She told him the board was undermining the community. She told him she had spent years protecting the neighborhood while the board did nothing. She told him that without her, standards would collapse and property values would fall. Bob told me he listened to all of it calmly. Then he told her the board's position stood. She left. And then, and this is important, she sent a letter to me. Handwritten, no letterhead this time. In it, she accused me of fabricating the situation, of conspiring with Bob to remove her from her role, and of deliberately targeting her reputation. I read it once. I photographed it. I put it in the folder. I didn't respond. But I want to tell you what happened next, because this is where the story moves from documentation and board meetings into something far more concrete. Something that involved no meetings, no letters, and no arguments. It involved snow. It was in early February when the second major storm of the season came through. The forecast was bad, 14 to 18 inches, they said. And they were right. By the time it stopped, we had 16 inches on the ground and the temperature had dropped to about 8 degrees overnight. I got up at 5 in the morning as usual. I had my coffee. I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about what I was going to do that day. I thought about Diane's demand letter to the board. I thought about the unauthorized fines she'd collected. I thought about the fake towing notice on my windshield. I thought about standing in 12-degree weather at 6:30 in the morning watching her photograph my tire tracks with a clipboard. And then I thought about the signed letter from the board authorizing my plowing arrangement, and the clause in that letter that said the arrangement could be terminated by either party with 7 days written notice. I had given no such notice, but I had that right. Instead of going out and plowing, I sat down and wrote a short email to Bob. I told him that given the current situation, the ongoing conflict, the formal complaint to the sheriff's office, the letter Diane had sent accusing me of fabrication, I felt that continuing to plow the shared road put me in a difficult position. I said I was not terminating the arrangement permanently, but that I needed to temporarily pause it while things were resolved. I asked if there was anyone else who could cover in the interim. Bob responded within 20 minutes. His message was short. He understood completely, would look into alternatives, and appreciated everything I'd done throughout the season. I did not plow the shared road that morning. By 7 a.m., The 42 households of Maple Crest Estates were looking at 16 inches of unplowed snow on their only road in and out of the community. Now, I want to be really clear about something. I am not proud of the fact that my neighbors were inconvenienced. Most of them had nothing to do with any of this. They were good people who had just been going about their lives. 3 or 4 of them couldn't get out to work that morning. One family with a school-aged kid had to call in and let the school know she wasn't coming in. That part genuinely bothered me. But here is what happened that morning that I did not orchestrate and did not plan. Several of those neighbors, frustrated by the unplowed road, started asking around about why it hadn't been cleared. Word spread quickly in a small community. By 9 a.m., multiple people had heard the story. By 11 a.m., there was a group chat among the homeowners that I wasn't part of but that I was told about later, where people were discussing why the road hadn't been plowed. Diane's name came up. The unauthorized fines came up. The formal board notice came up. Bob, to his enormous credit, was transparent. He sent a community-wide email that morning explaining simply that the volunteer plowing arrangement had been paused pending resolution of an ongoing dispute, and that he was working on a solution. He did not name Diane. He didn't need to. By noon, Diane had been contacted by 4 separate neighbors who had not-so-subtle questions about the situation. 2 of them had received unauthorized fine notices themselves and were now, in the context of this larger story, much less inclined to let that go quietly. The board held an emergency session that afternoon via phone call. By the end of the day, 2 things had happened. First, one of the board members, who had a pickup truck with a plow but had never volunteered because he didn't want the responsibility, cleared the road that afternoon. It took him most of the evening, but he got it done. Second, the board issued a formal written resolution revoking Diane's Community Standards Coordinator title, the one she'd never officially had, and formally barring her from issuing any communications using HOA branding. It was unanimous. And the $900 she had collected from homeowners through unauthorized fines? The board used its contingency fund to repay those homeowners directly, and then placed a lien on Diane's property for the equivalent amount, which she would be required to address at time of sale. The HOA attorney handled all of it. I want to ask you something. Do you think Diane saw any of this coming? The one morning she'd probably been hoping would be a mess, the big storm, the chaos, the opportunity to maybe point at me and say, see, this is why we need standards, ended up being the morning everything unraveled for her. And I never yelled. I never confronted her. I just stopped doing something I had every right to stop doing. February finished out quietly. I resumed plowing the road after about a week. Bob had reached out and asked if I was willing to continue, and I said yes, as long as there was clear written confirmation, again, that my arrangement was authorized and that no outside party had any standing to challenge it. He sent me that confirmation within the day. The board member who'd plowed during that one storm told me it was a lot harder than it looked, and that he had renewed respect for my getting up at 5 a.m. every time it snowed. We laughed about it. He brought me over a 6-pack of craft beer the following weekend, which was one of the nicer gestures I'd received since moving in. Diane was still in the neighborhood. That's worth saying plainly. She still lived on the same street. She still went on walks. I'd see her occasionally. We didn't speak, but I didn't avoid her either. I'd nod if we made eye contact. She generally looked away. I don't know exactly how she processed everything that happened. I'm not in her head. But I do know that the notes stopped. The notices stopped. The phone calls and towing warnings stopped. As far as I could tell, the clipboard was put away, at least as far as my property was concerned. What I took from the whole experience was something fairly simple, and I think it's worth saying out loud. The people who abuse informal authority almost always count on others not knowing their rights. Diane's whole system worked because most people got a note that looked official and assumed it was. The moment someone started documenting, asking questions, and going directly to the people who actually had authority, the actual board, her leverage disappeared almost immediately. I didn't need to be aggressive. I didn't need to get a lawyer, though I was getting close to it. I just needed to be organized, patient, and willing to let the process work. And I needed to know exactly what I was and wasn't obligated to do, including on cold February mornings with 16 inches of snow on the ground. The road got plowed all the way through March. I submitted my log at the end of the season. Bob processed the stipend payment. We shook hands at the annual spring meeting, which I attended for the first time that year. Nobody mentioned Diane at the meeting. but there were a few more people there than usual for a spring HOA session. And the board president mentioned, almost as a footnote, that the HOA had updated its communication policies to clarify who was authorized to send official notices. Just a quiet procedural update, he said. Nothing dramatic, which seemed about right. So, 42 homes, one road, one woman with a clipboard, and one guy who just wanted to do his job, keep his word, and not have his truck towed out of his own driveway. If there's one thing this whole situation reinforced for me, it's this. In any kind of HOA dispute, or really any conflict involving rules and authority, the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm and know what's actually true. Not what someone is telling you is true. Not what looks official. What is actually, verifiably, documentably true. Diane had years of practice operating in a gray zone where most people didn't push back. The moment someone did, and did it calmly, through proper channels, without drama, the whole structure collapsed. Not because she was evil, not because she was malicious in some comic book villain way, but because her authority was built entirely on other people's uncertainty and discomfort with conflict. The second that uncertainty went away, so did her leverage. If you've ever dealt with an HOA situation, unreasonable rules, self-appointed enforcers, vague violations, surprise fines, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. Tell me how it started, how it ended, and whether you got a satisfying resolution or whether it's still ongoing. Some of the best conversations I've had on this channel have started in the comments section, and I read through every single one. If this story resonated with you, go ahead and hit the like button. It actually makes a real difference in getting this content to more people who need to hear it. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because I promise you, the stories only get more interesting from here. I've got another HOA situation coming up, one that involves a fence, a property line that nobody measured correctly for 14 years, and one very determined retired accountant who decided to fix that oversight himself one weekend in October. That one has a conclusion that absolutely nobody in the neighborhood saw coming. Until then, stay organized, know your rights, and keep your documentation in a folder. I'll see you in the next one.